Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bull Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex, as always, here to talk about your Chargers questions. I sort of wanted to do this as a final Q&A heading into the, extended doldrums of the offseason. We're going to get into OTAs next week, minicamp, so there are things going on. But with the draft over and all that stuff, I probably will be taking a little bit of a video break from the channel and then come back around July for training camp. I will still take my podcast mic and my camera with me back to the U.S. in case I am called upon by Stephen or Tyler to come on the show, or if a big trade or something happens or signings and we want to talk about it on this show, then I will still be at the ready for that. But I will be probably taking a little bit of a break until we get back into some of the camp stuff. I'll still have to see if I'm going to camp this year and do all that, but I would like to obviously do some videos as we ramp up into that phase of the off season. So probably be back around then. But for the time being, I reached out to the people of Twitter and YouTube to take your guys' questions. And before we start, I would say, we have been. I mean, I've been going at it certainly every week. I know Steven and Tyler have as well. From week 1 to week 18 to the Texans game to the aftermath to the draft. You guys have been following along, and the show has been doing good. I have not been canceled by my superiors and Steven and Tyler. They still let me upload once a week to the channel. So the viewership numbers are good enough to the point where I haven't been thrown off the channel yet. So we're doing good enough numbers there. So thanks to you guys seriously for watching, and I will be back later this offseason. But for the time being, we have a Q&A to get to. So let's get into it. The first question comes from Peter M340. Surprising Hopper, I think his name is Popper's prediction for a 9-8 win-loss record for the Chargers with not making the playoffs this season. Your thoughts? My honest thoughts are, if you have a record prediction that isn't 17-0 for the Chargers, don't post it on twitter.com. For those who don't know, I sent off a rather innocuous tweet on scheduled release night where I just said 10-7, 5th seed. Like, that was kind of my prediction I was coming out with on draft night, and I got some interesting replies from the fan police who thought it wasn't high enough, which ironically were some of the same people who said that they didn't do enough in the offseason in my mentions a month and a half ago. But that's neither here nor there. But as far as a 9-8 record prediction, I know Steven and Tyler went 12-5 on the show. Chris Ribb and Popper, who he's referring to, went 9-8. I ended up at 10-7, so I'm sort of in the middle of those two predictions, I think. I don't think it's insane to do a 9-8 prediction, and I don't know why we're talking about it that way. Now, in theory, yes. Like, I get the binary way of looking at it, where you're just like, oh, well, the team went 11-6 last year, so therefore they should be better this year. And the way that I think about it is really, I think just from a competitive standpoint, not win-losses, like how many games they will be in with competitive NFL teams, I think their floor is way higher just as a competitive team this season and what they can potentially do in the playoffs, right? Versus last team's team made the playoffs in part because they beat up on some of the weaker teams in the league. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but they did take advantage of their schedule and they won the games they were supposed to, and they got in, right? But obviously, as the Texans game showed, a lot of things that still separate them from the cream of the crop in the NFL. Not even necessarily the Texans, but the Eagles, the Chiefs, the Bills, so on and so forth, right? Ravens. And so I think my thing is, I think this is a better roster than they put together last year. But, and don't take it from me, take it from Navarro Bowman, who spoke at the podium this week and said, quote, that they took advantage of a lot of average quarterbacks last year, and that the defense and the linebacker group, they want to do better against, the Patrick Mahomeses of the league and all the high-end guys, right? And so I think this Chargers staff also recognizes that they took advantage of a weaker schedule last year and need to be at a higher level if they're going to contend for the playoffs and contend for the Super Bowl, all of that kind of stuff. So that is to say, like, I do think the roster is upgraded. I do think there are question marks on the roster. What are they going to do in the offensive line? How much implicit trust do you have in the defensive line now? That's a little thinner, without Joey Bosa, who had his health issues, but was the top line starter there. Now, can Tuli be a full-time edge too? Is a question, right? Can they replace Puna's production? So on and so forth. All the questions there. So the team floor-wise, with what they did in the offseason in terms of upgrading all the offensive skill positions, getting Mekhi Becton in the building, and really, bringing back a lot of the key guys on defense outside of Puna, I think is in a good spot, right? But it's just like the reality is, instead of, the Saints and the Panthers and the Falcons this year, you have the Eagles, the Commanders, who are both NFC, conference finalists, and, the Cowboys potentially with a healthy Dak, right? Who should, in theory, be better, right? That's the NFC division you're playing. It is tougher. I'm not going to go through like every single opponent and be like, this was harder, this was easier. But another example, right? I still expect them to win 2 games against the Raiders, I think. But this Raiders team this year should be more competitive than the one last year. Like, and this is not to like doom about the Chargers divisional opponents, but like, they obviously have 2 teams in their division who made the playoffs last year with the Chiefs and the Broncos. And the Raiders on paper should be more competitive than when they were starting, Aiden O'Connell and Gardner, the corpse of Gardner Minshew at quarterback. And they made a massive coaching upgrade with Pete Carroll. It's not to say they're going to be an amazing team next year, but again, just an example of a team that I think compared to the Raiders team the Chargers played last year will be more competitive in those games. And so, I think wherever you look on the schedule, it is harder. That is not to say that they can't win those games. That is not to say they can't be, maybe competitive with the Eagles or, the Commanders or some of the tougher teams that they have on their schedule compared to last season. Obviously, you have the Chiefs in the mix, the Broncos in the mix, all the other teams that we've talked about as well. But they're playing a second place schedule instead of a fourth place schedule. And like that, and play the NFC East instead of the NFC South. Those things are just facts, right? Like, I don't know, I guess, how else to really say it. So I think a lot of people would consider 9-8, consider 10-7, consider that to be a failure because, well, they went 11-6 last year. But like, to me, if I see that the team is more competitive, if I see that the team is putting out a better product and is better in the trenches than they were last year, and they're better all around skill position wise, where the offense doesn't, completely grind to a halt if like Josh Palmer is missing a game, as we saw like in the Texans game where they had QJ and Chark on the outside. Like, that's the kind of stuff I need to see going forward. I'm less concerned about, oh my God, how many games are they going to win? Is it going to be 12 or is it going to be 10? Is it going to be 9? Is it going to be 13? Like, I just want to see the team, to be honest, take steps forward. Because for me, I'm not going to say they can't win a Super Bowl in 2025. You never know. But I've always viewed 2026 as the first, okay, this is the window kind of a year of the Harbaugh, administration, if you will, from the moment him and Ortiz got here, right? I did think it was a 2-3 year kind of rebuild, not because, oh my God, the roster was so bad, but just because you need time. You need to let your draft classes matriculate, get in the door, have those guys start playing, producing value on the rookie contracts, all the things that we talked about last year, while you're also making moves in the margins and trying to upgrade both starters and depth on the team. And so to me, I always thought 2026 and 2027 were more the years for the Chargers than this season upcoming is. So I still have them being competitive. I have them being 10-7. but I don't think 9-8 is like this insane prediction that it's been made out to be. I guess from Popper and Rim, and like, injury luck plays into that. Obviously, scores in one-score games. What's the confidence you feel on the offensive line, the defensive line, etc. A lot of the things that we've talked about. But I'm at 10-7. I'm kind of in the middle ground, and I do have them making the playoffs as the 5th seed again. But I don't want to go into too much record prediction talk because we've gotten into it. But in short, just to summarize, I think this is a better team. And if they look like a better team on the field, then personally, I don't care if they're 1 or 2 games worse or 1 game better than they were last year, if I still see that the team and the roster is headed in the right direction. And people will say, oh, that's a cop-out answer. But like, I really do think you can't compare this team and this schedule to last year's team and schedule, and then be kind of honest about it, like without being honest about it, I should say. So those are just kind of my thoughts there, but I don't want to ramble about the schedule for too long. Bolt up to 158. I'm worried about the interior offensive line. Do you think Mekhi and Andre James, can get us to above average? All right, let's start with Mekhi. Yeah, I mean, I think Mekhi will be a great fit at right guard, assuming that he can stay healthy. Obviously did last season for the Eagles in their Super Bowl run. The run game is getting a massive boost in that regard compared to Mekhi and, his skills there at guard relative to Trey. And I think Mekhi already showed what he can do in that regard. The pass blocking, I think, will be maybe a concern for Mekhi, but still a massive upgrade there in both the pass game and the run game. Injuries are a little bit of a question for Mekhi, not necessarily last year, but I do think you look at the totality of injuries over the years, you look at how big he is, right? Like, that is a concern. And so I do feel comfortable knowing, I guess, with this constructed offensive line, that you have Pipkins and Salyer as the depth pieces as opposed to as, the quasi starters, if you will. Pipkins, the starter last year, Salyer. I like that now they are sort of, the depth of this team rather than the starters of this team. And I think that ultimately is a step in the right direction. So I think Mekhi lifts the floor of this offensive line quite a bit. Let's talk about Andre James. I don't want to poop on the hopes of Twitter.com. I don't want to, necessarily like correct the fan base if you're really hoping that Andre James does start. And again, I think Andre James has a path to starting. Like, I do think there is a path to, hey, if he comes out and he just dominates training camp, like, the coaching staff is not going to be obtuse to that, right? Like, they're going to say, okay, we're going to pick the better guy and go with him if that were to happen. But if you've listened to how they've talked about Bozeman and Zion, I think it's pretty clear Bozeman and Zion are going to be the starters in some order at left guard and center. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be the starters the whole season, depending on, like, how that goes, injuries, or, what their level of performance is, so on and so forth. But I ultimately do think it'll be those two starting at the center and left guard spots. Whenever Ortiz or Harbaugh talk about it, unless Andre James is brought up by somebody else, they do not mention him. They specifically mention Bozeman and Zion. Harbaugh went as far as to say, I think it was last week or a week and a half ago, Bozeman and Zion alternating days at left guard and center on the first team, while you have, Andre James working with like second and third teams, right? Like that is what has been happening in camp, in, this phase of the offseason program going into camp. And I also question how much of a competition it necessarily is, because look, the Chargers had their offensive line figured out by 2 weeks from now last year, right? Like, it was, June 11th, June 12th, when Harbaugh spoke to the media and he said, hey, from left to right, it's going to be Slater, Zion, Bozeman, Pipkins, and Alt, right? So, like, I think they already have a pretty decent idea of who is going to be starting on the offensive line and where they're going to be starting. I think the next couple of weeks of minicamp are going to be confirmatory in their diagnosis. So I think it is a more the next month competition than it is like 2 months in terms of training camp. I think we'll have a pretty decent idea before then. But again, it's not impossible for Andre James to earn a spot. I don't want to say that. But I think if you listen to the coaching staff and how they spoke, and also how they've moved around them, I think they clearly view Andre James right now as a depth piece. And I think they view Bozeman and Zion as your presumptive starters. Doesn't mean that can't change, but to me, that is where things are standing right now. And I think Andre James, for the record, if he's not starting, is great depth compared to what they have had previously. The fact that you can plug him in at center, potentially move him around at guard, kind of in the way that I was just talking about, Pipkins and Sally are being move aroundable, but now as depth instead of the presumptive starters at the positions. But any way that you cut it, I ultimately, gun to my head, I have to say who's starting week 1. I think it'll be Bradley Bozeman at center, Zion at left guard. All right. What steps over the next couple of years do you think need to be taken for this to turn into a Super Bowl contending roster? Do you think that this team can seriously contend with Greg Roman? I think the roster needs to get to a point where we can evaluate Greg Roman. I sort of talked about this with Theo Ash, and people, look, I do not hide it from people. I am not a Greg Roman fan. I am not, my offensive views of how things should be constructed. People remember back in the day, I kind of wanted Ben Johnston hired because I gravitate more to that offensively than the Greg Roman side of things. But to me, the roster was not in a position to make a judgment off of Greg Roman last year, where he couldn't install the run game because the tools to make that run game were not there, right? You were working with J.K. Dobbins and, not much else in the running back room. You were working with, an offensive line that was not the way that they wanted to necessarily come in with, right? As far as the depth and the starters who could impact there. Kai is obviously a huge floor raiser in that department. So I think this year, as well as 2026, will be the opportunities to evaluate Greg Roman going forward. As far as what changes do they need to be a Super Bowl team? I need to see that consistent top 5, top 10 offensive line play. I mean, look at the recent Super Bowl champions, the Eagles, the Chiefs. All of the teams that have gone to the Super Bowl have had great offensive line play. I've seen moments of it, right? Obviously, we see Slater and Alt's brilliance, of course. And we see, some games where they have put together, as a whole, the offensive line has put together good games. But against the good teams, against the good pass rushes, I need to know that they have answers. And that's a TBD after the Texans game. And we have to see how they perform this year. So I think the offensive line is one thing. How much their offensive weapons develop, right, in Hampton and Trey Harris, and how Ladd continues to develop. Probably a tight end away a little bit long term too. Can Arande fill that role, or do they draft a guy next year, so on and so forth? And then the defense. I do think the defense, particularly at the second and third levels, is pretty good. I think there's still probably a couple moves away in the defensive line, and then at some point, we will probably approach conversation about what's the long-term role of Khalil Mack, in terms of bringing the edge room into the future a little bit. And does the future of the edge room ultimately include Thule? Does it include some of the guys that are, Bud Dupree down the roster a little bit right now? Or is it, draft picks to be spent on that premium, edge position, if you will, in the future? Kyle Kennard is obviously part of the vision there. What is his development like in year 1, year 2, year 3, right? So I would say both sides. I'd say if I have to boil it down to one thing, it is they have to go from okay trench team to really, really, really good elite trench play, because that is what is ultimately winning in the NFL right now. But as far as the Greg Roman piece of this, I think that he gets 2 more years and then they'll evaluate after 2026, maybe 2025, but I think that's pretty unlikely. William Soul, 2136. Do you feel like too many fans have written off QJ, or do you expect a better year for him because now he's expected to play in his more natural position of Z and not a downfield X? So I think with QJ, it's about what your expectations are for him. I do not have the expectations anymore that he is going to be, oh my God, he's going to live up to his billing as a first round pick and here comes 1,000 yards, so on and so forth, right? QJ will still have a role in this offense, I think, pretty clearly. But like, I think by drafting Trey Harris and by drafting Trey Harris and signing Mike Williams, like, you have made it clear that you do not want QJ playing X receiver, as he mentions in his comment, right? Like, they want QJ doing some of the more underneath stuff. They've been working on him with like jet sweeps and ways to get with him in motion, as you know, the clip they posted, I think, the other day. So like, that to me is like, okay, have him work on the underneath stuff, have him work on, you know, a lot of those shorter route concepts. Because I think QJ did improve last year, right? Like, the route running was better. I think ultimately his ball tracking was a little bit better, but he still has the problems at the catch point. He still has the problems playing through contact, and both of those things came into play in the Baltimore game last year, as well as the Texans playoff game against Staley and Lester, right? So like that is kind of where I stand on QJ. I still think he is a useful NFL player, right? It's about finding what he does in this offense that can be used. I think pretty clearly by drafting Trey Harris and by signing Mike Williams, as I mentioned earlier, that they have made it known what skill sets they want there. And to me, QJ doesn't necessarily align, but there's going to be times where QJ is lined up outside, of course. But I do think this is a prove it year from QJ to, can you fit in the nucleus of where the team is going, right? Can you be a bit more of the rotational receiver? And, you know, when your number's called upon, can you act type of way, compared to, hey, you're just going to be basically wide receiver 1 the whole year, and you're going to be the guy playing outside Josh Palmer, like clear or opposite Josh Palmer, sort of like last year, right? Ladd obviously is a huge part on the inside. So I think my expectations for QJ are continue improving, continue doing what, you know, he's been doing in year 2. Because there were steps taken last year, right? I think it's just about finding what the right role for him is. So I get why fans are frustrated with him. I get why they're always going to, you know, view him as a bust and all these things. But to me, I think he showed enough improvement, and my expectation is not for him to live up to his first round pick billing anymore. My expectation is, hey, can you just fit into the nucleus of the team? Can you fit around Trey Harris and Mike Williams and Ladd, and show why you belong in that regard, rather than, hey, can you take another step forward as far as like being 1,000-yard guy? Like, that's, you know, the expectations for me have changed, both based on what I saw QJ improve on last year, which was good, but still some of his faults, and the way that the Chargers have moved to build the roster around him. So regardless of what they say about QJ, they've let us know with their moves what they think of the future going forward, I think, pretty clearly. How much of the playoff loss to the Texans do you attribute to the lack of a running game on our part, and how much do you attribute to our O-line? I personally think not having Omarion and Najee to pound the rock in that game makes a big difference, even though I like JK. I really don't know if Omarion and Najee make a big difference that game. The lack of a consistent running game is, they ran what it was like 9 carries for 26 yards. I forget exactly what it was. It wasn't good. I remember that part. They had some success on that first drive with JK, and then really never again did they have success in that game. And then obviously they got down by such a margin that they could not run the ball. I think for me, the run game obviously has to be more consistent for sure. I think where I think the run game fits in is more when you have those leads, can you kind of rest on your run game a little bit, right? I even think back to the Bengals game from last year. Right now, obviously they get the big run from Dobbins on the final drive, and that punctuates the game against the Bengals. But they kind of almost blew that lead to an extent because they were going very pass happy. The pass offense wasn't working, and they didn't really trust their ability to just kind of like end it with the ground game when you do have a 20+ point lead. And so I think the run game applies, yes, consistently from down to down, but also in those situations where you have the lead and you want to keep it, can you effectively run the ball as well? I think is a big question this year. And I think Omarion and Najee will be big in that. I don't really think the Texans game goes differently based off of, starting Salyer there, the quality of the games Bozeman and Zion had, as well as, obviously those guys get a lot of flack, but it was not necessarily Alt or Slater's best game either, right? Like they, Alt in particular got owned a couple times in that game. So I think for me that was more an offensive line breakdown than it was oh my god, if they had a better running back. Like I think the floor for how many like yards and carries they would have gotten would have been a little higher. I think the yards would have been a little higher, but to me I don't know if it makes a big difference in that Texans game, but obviously it will make a big difference this year with Mekhi in the fold and like where they think the run game in theory should be this year for sure. What do you see as the single biggest challenge facing the Chargers this season? What would be your solution if you were part of the coaching staff? Biggest challenge this season? I'd say for me, the biggest challenge is just, I would say the offensive line is kind of, we've talked about it a little bit, but like without making direct changes to center and left guard, how do you get better results in the running game and in the passing game? And they've done that, right? Like they've gotten the skill position players to be able to contribute to that. So like I think on offense, that is like the biggest question is like, can you get Mekhi, kick Zion in a center, or have him back at left guard, whatever the configuration is? Does the offensive line in year 2 under Greg Roman have a high enough floor to the point where you don't get, the disaster games like the Texans game? I think that is kind of the biggest challenge on offense. On defense, I would say it is generating your pass rush pressure. I mentioned that before, but like they are losing about 25 pressures with Poona Ford, 32 pressures with Morgan Fox. So like, not that I think that production is irreplaceable, but who does step up next to be able to fill in that role between Hand, Jones, Tart, obviously is kind of your, DT1, if you want to call him that at the moment. Can Caldwell, right, kind of make an impact early? I saw some really nice stuff that I liked from him at Oregon, even though I think a lot of people made a big deal that like he didn't have the sack numbers, but his pressure numbers were pretty good, and he was pretty consistently getting pressure. So to me, I think he can have an impact there, but I'd say to me, like I mentioned earlier, I think both lines and how much of a step forward they can take this year is really the limiting agent or what can propel them to Super Bowl. What would be my solution? See how this season plays out and then get better players if they're not good enough. John O'Brien, Herbert throws for 5K. Will you run a 5K? You know what? I'll commit to running a 5K if Herbert throws for 5K. Come back to this video May 23rd, and I'll do it. I'll do it as a live stream if he does throw for 5,000 yards, just because Herbert, I want to work hard. So if Herbert shows us his hard work, I will return the favor. I don't think many quarterbacks are throwing for 5,000 yards, honestly, but hopefully this is motivation enough for Herbert so he can see me gasp doing a 5K pretty consistently. So you think this offense will be able to make strides in the time of possession department, and how improved do you think they will be? How much do you think it could affect their win total? Defensively, do you think trading for Kayvon Thibodeau from New York could be in the cards? I don't know if there's any more to that question, but I kind of like, he's young. He's still, obviously high round pick. I don't think the Giants move on from Thibodeau at this point. I mean, I know they have a lot of edges in that room, but I think that's kind of the strength of their team right now. So, I kind of don't think they're moving on from him in that regard. As far as the time of possession stuff, I do. This is exactly what I mentioned. I think Hampton and Najee is absolutely a higher floor run game than JK and then Gus, which was a pretty precipitous drop off, last season. Just statistically speaking, the Chargers were 15th in rush EPA when JK touched the ball from weeks 1 to 12, and then when he got hurt, they were 30th in EPA in the 4 games he missed, right? So that stuff makes a difference. So the fact that they now have pretty good depth at running back between Najee and Omarion and the guys that are taking their carries, and Mackay at right guard, I think they will be able to make strides in time of possession solely for the fact that they're not having to over rely on their passing game, even with leads, as I mentioned in that Bengals game, to be able to kind of run the clock out in certain games. So I think in that vein, they should be on paper a better time of possession team this season. Eddie Saldana, enjoy the offseason, enjoy all the hard work you do, and see you in July. A lot won't happen until our Bolts play in the Hall of Fame game on July 31st. So that's probably a good time frame for when we will be back, and we'll be busy for preseason games this year. Fun stuff. Faison 100, are there better alternatives to Zion Johnson next year? Because I don't see any next offseason, but I think you can make it work if Zion reaches his ceiling, which is really high to begin with. In your mind, Alex, Zion Johnson getting a better idea of what to expect of defenses from working at the center position, I think he will and will excel this season, forcing the Chargers to re-sign him next year. What say you? I am wait and see on it. Look, I think Zion's always been really smart. I think he's always had physical ability. This is why he was a first-round pick. I do not think his tape to this point justifies re-signing him next year, wherever you watch it. Whether I think his 2022 stuff was obviously pretty good next to Corey Linsley, but it's been pretty inconsistent. Some good games and then some bad games. So yeah, I would say at this point I'm pretty out on re-signing Zion going forward. But look, if he shows up and he starts at center, he starts at left guard, and he makes it, he makes the team re-sign them and takes that step forward that we've been wanting him to take, that would be great. But I think that it just, I would not project that, right? I think it could work, right? If this is, again, you're having the competent system from this year to last year, you're not necessarily having to learn anything new about how Greg Roman wants you to play the run game. I guess if he converts to center, it would be a little bit different. I'm still kind of skeptical that he actually ends up playing center, but we'll see. But yeah, so I don't know. I just think Zion is in a prove-it year. They turned down the 5th-year option, and we'll kind of see and go from there. I think he has the ability to be a starting center. I mean, we were all excited personally here at GAC when he was the pick. People make fun of us for it because there's that gif of Stephen Arjun and Tyler at the draft dancing around. Luckily, I wasn't jumping around when they made the pick. But I like the Zion pick too, to the point where I thought he was a pretty, day one starter that you can just insert on your offensive line. In 2022, he was, and he was pretty good. It just, since then, it has not been the level of play that you need to be an elite offensive line. And it's important to be honest about that, whether we were right or wrong on our draft priors. And so I see a path to Zion, going forward and having a great year this year. Am I going to predict that without having reason to predict it, though? Not really. The tape last year wasn't great. Daniel Vizuit, will Gadsden see significant playing time this year? Huge fan, by the way. So I think how much playing time Gadsden gets is pretty interesting because, right, Harbaugh and the staff have talked about working with him on blocking, but they seem pretty confident from what they've said that he's going to play kind of an immediate role. Obviously, they have Tyler Conklin as the other pure pass catching tight end on the roster, and then you have Disley for the screen stuff. I think he'll be a little bit less involved, obviously, in the passing game than he was last year, where he basically had to be the passing game because Hayden Hurst was injured and ultimately didn't play. So I think you'll see a decent amount of Gadsden the deeper that we get into the year. Kind of a little bit like how they started playing Stone Smart a little bit more last year. Obviously, a little bit that was more injury based, but the more snaps he got, the Chiefs game, they kind of couldn't keep him off the field a little bit. I could see that kind of development for Gadsden, as you get later into the year, in particular, while you have Conklin and Disley playing a lot to start. Yeah, obviously injuries dictate a lot. If something happens to Conklin, if something happens to Disley, then Gadsden's playing no matter what. But I do think he is an incredibly effective sideline red zone type target, where I think that kind of skill set could also get him some decent volume pretty early on. So I think they clearly have a plan to use him from day one. Whether or not he's tight end one or anything like that, I don't think he's that from the jump. But would I write it off by necessarily the end of the season? Probably not. I do think he has identifiable skills as an above the rim red zone guy that I think he could contribute into this offense pretty quickly. Tony Franco, how are you feeling about our corners? They're all young and with little experience. Do we trade for a vet or maybe sign one? I talked about corners a little bit of a sneaky need. I don't think they end up signing a guy because I kind of think they really have their guys as far as Tarheeb, Cam, Dante Jackson, St. Just, and then obviously when we talk about corner, Trequez Bridges fits in there as well. Obviously, Josier Taylor, anyone? But I do think my opinion of the cornerback room and where I think it can go, I feel really good about watching how Derwin played in the slot last year, to the point where even though we don't talk about Derwin as a corner, he won second team All-Pro by playing the slot. I think that was some of the best work of his career, obviously, what he did there last year. And I think if you have him this year, regardless of who you have on the outside and regardless of who you have in the nickel packages when Derwin isn't at slot, I think that it provides a really good boost for the rest of what you do in all of the other packages, that you can kind of rely on Derwin in that context. So I don't think this is obviously the most talented blue chip cornerback room. But like I said, I think my question more lies in the defensive front and the defensive line than it does the quarterback room to this point. And I think you can see steps from Tarheeb and Cam. Obviously, Tarheeb was very impressive last year, and Cam, it's just a matter of can he stay on the field. Giovanni Sandoval. My theory, which was actually near confirmed by Ortiz on the Chargers Weekly pod. Am I not able to I don't know why I can't see the full comment. Maybe is it because I'm zoomed in too much? It might be because I'm zoomed in too much. Oh yeah, it was because I was zoomed in too much. All right. So yeah, the Kayvon Thibodeau question from last year. So okay, he's probably edge 3 over there, and he could make a solid depth piece or injury insurance pretty cheap in my opinion. Like I said, I don't think the Giants are trading him. Going back to this question, that's why those questions weren't loading, because they were too long. I didn't realize I was zoomed in that much. But anyway, from Giovanni Sandoval, My theory, which was near confirmed by Ortiz in the Chargers Weekly Pod, is that they were going to draft Rocket Sanders in the mid rounds. Hampton dropping to them changed the entire course of their draft. Rocket Sanders is being treated like a draft pick because he essentially is. Does the running back room now seem too bloated? If so, is it worth it to do that this year to essentially have Rocket to replace Najee next year? I don't really think that that's what Ortiz confirmed on Chargers Weekly. Like, I think the way that like being an undrafted player works and not getting drafted works to some extent is like there's a lot of agentry, I would say, involved in that, where you have agents that are, working the lines with all these teams as to what is the interest in their guy. Like, do they expect the guy drafted? Of course, teams that have talked to them most as like undrafted free agency fits. And we've seen this with the Chargers in the past, in the draft, actually, where like I think they took Xander Horvath because they were afraid of him hitting undrafted free agency. Max Duggan was another guy that, like, I don't know if that was like fully reported, but like he had meetings, I think, with the Jets and the Cowboys, and the Chargers for whatever reason were like dying to have him. So then they took him in the 7th round, even though he kind of sucked. But anyway, I hated that pick at the time so much. God. Anyway, so when it comes to Rocket, I say that to say that the Chargers, I think, had the expectation that he was going to go undrafted, and I think the league had the expectation that he was going to go undrafted based on not just where he was on like the teams boards, the NFL team consensus boards that we can't see, but Rocket was consistently like in the late 200s, 300s on some sites. I don't understand that. As I said, I was one of Rocket's earliest fans. I had him, top 12, 13 on my board. I loved watching him a lot. But 12, 13 running backs, I mean, to be clear. So I don't think that Omarion changed their mind on taking a running back. Now, I think without taking Omarion, like say Derek Harmon fell to them and they took Derek Harmon, then in that scenario, I think they would have taken a running back rounds 2 to 4. And I think they would have taken Scattaboo, maybe, who I had heard that they did a lot of work on. I think, any of the second round options, obviously, that were there. Tyler's guy, RJ Harvey, who then went to Denver, right? Like, there's a lot of domino effects. I think that they don't take Hampton in the first round, that they do take a running back sometime in rounds 2 through 4. I don't think that would have been Raheem Sanders. And like, Harbaugh and Ortiz do this thing where it's like, oh, well, like we had a mid-round grade on that guy. They did this with Brendan Rice last year too, where it's like, oh yeah, we had a 3rd-round grade on him, and then he was available the 7th. It was like, okay, but you passed on him like 3 or 4 times before you got around back to him, right? So it's like, okay, I appreciate you talking up to your guy, but I only believe that to such a point. But yeah, like I believe the team is incredibly high on Rocket Sanders. He was pretty much their top priority undrafted free agent. And I think is clearly the undrafted free agent that has the best chance to make this roster. I would just say I thought he was always going to go undrafted. I don't think it changed by anything they did in the draft. As far as is the running back room too bloated? No. Like it would be weird to be like, oh man, the Chargers have no depth, and then be like, whoa, we have a little too much depth here. But in all seriousness, I think how this ends up shaking out is I think Hampton, Najee are locks for the roster, obviously. And I think they will take 2 out of the 3 on the roster between Vidal, Sanders, and Haskins. I think 2 of those 3 will make the roster, and they'll go with 4 running backs. And then that can obviously change throughout the year. If like maybe one week they only need to carry 3 because they have another position, right? I'm also not necessarily scared about like, oh, what happens if you like cut Sanders or cut Kimani or like cut Haskins. Like I think there's pretty likely at the end of the day that those guys get back to you on the practice squad. Like I don't think that that's like as big of a deal as it's made out to be, personally, in my opinion. So I think my thing would be, it's not that big of a deal to be like too bloated, whether they keep 3 or keep 4 running backs. I think one of those guys between Vidal and Sanders will be on the practice squad. Haskins probably makes it as your special teams guy, I would think. And then so I think that one last spot is probably between Kimani and Rocket. A lot of people have written off Kimani, which like I get because like last season was not amazing by any means, but I think he showed enough flashes last year to the point where if he does improve on the blocking, I do think he would be able to play. That was really the reason that he got benched last year. But I would also just say, if you're like, oh man, like Kamani got blocked, Kamani got benched because that phase of the game. I love Rocket Sanders. I love both of them to death. They were both of my guys, both 2 years of the draft. Like if I had a running back day 3 guy, one of them was Rocket Sanders one year, one was Kamani the other year. I have Twitter posts to prove it. Trust me. But I would say Rocket was not a great blocker and not a great special teams guy, right? Like that is not where he excels. Now, that's not to say he can't, get there in the NFL. I think he has the prototypical running back frame to do it. But I think a lot of people just say, oh, well, Kamani's small and Rocket's big. So therefore, like one should be a much better blocker than the other and a much better in that phase of the game, which could win over the coaching staff. But it's like, I think they're both competing in that regard this year to say like, and that's what I think this competition ultimately comes down to as well. Like in terms of if you keep Kimani or keep Rocket, the offensive volume with Najee and Omarion will be so strong that I kind of don't think it matters. Like, I think it matters, obviously, what they do with their carries in the preseason and what they do in training camp. But I think it'll be more what they do in the other phases of the game, particularly special teams, that like, and the blocking that like matters a little bit more than what they do as runners, because they're both good runners. Like I've seen enough from them both in college, Kimani in the preseason last year, all that kind of stuff to say, okay, like they know what they're both good in that regard. What separates them within the margins, I think kind of determines which one of them makes the roster. And I think we had 2 more questions. Roostery TV, do you think Herbert is better than Burrow? By the way, I do think Herbert's better. I think Burrow's better. Kill me in the dislike section. I don't care. I have one of them 4 and one of them 5. I don't really give a shit. Alan Cleary, 4660. Do you think we should sign Hernandez or Scherf prior to OTAs? Thanks. Steven and Tyler talked a little bit about Scherf and Hernandez. I think on the episode they just did about like guys they could bring in as depth signings and trades. I wouldn't be surprised by either of them, but I also think the offensive line room is a little cluttered right now to the point where, okay, if you're keeping Taylor and you're keeping James, who they already signed as their interior offensive lineman signing, like plus they have Salyer, plus Pipkins, you're sort of getting to the point where you don't necessarily have another spot if you're keeping 9. I don't think it's impossible to sign another offensive lineman, but I would say right now I don't think they're signing one unless there is some kind of injury or something of that nature, if I had to bet. All right. So now I didn't think I would spend 45 minutes on the YouTube questions, but now let's get into the questions from twitter.com. We are not done yet. Of course, the journey continues. So let's get into the questions from Twitter. Luis BLD Bruin, do you think that the Chargers will have a top 10 rushing offense the next season, or is having the QB that's part of the run game design vital for the Greg Roman offense? Forgot to put the questions up. I don't know how much Herbert's going to be super involved in the running game next year. Like, I don't know if they're going to design a ton of stuff for him. Obviously, I think they will like do QB sneaks and things of that nature when they have to. But like, he did have the ankle injury this year, which didn't happen on a run play. It happened, trying to extend a passing play. But like, I do think they'll be pretty Herbert will run when he needs to. I don't think they will necessarily be like designed looks though, right? And so I think he'll have good rushing yardage. But I think the running game will largely be on the running backs. Top 10 rushing offense. I think it's possible. I think they'll be somewhere between, if I had to realistically like guess, I'll say between like 11 and 15. Top 11 and top 15. That's kind of the range I see the running game in personally. But I think obviously a much better floor than last year, where they're not going to be hopefully 30th in EPA for like 4 or 5 game stretch. Malte, I've got a few positional questions. Who do you think is going to end up starting at left guard and center? What will the DT rotation look like? Left guard and center, we've already talked about it, but I do think left guard will be Zion. Center will be Bradley Bozeman. It's possible Zion wins the job in camp at center, but that's kind of where I see it right now. In the defensive tackle rotation, I think you have Tair. You have Deshaun Hand, obviously, in there too, as kind of a top pass rusher. Naquan at your nose tackle, and you'll have kind of Naquan and Jamari sort of rotating. Jamar Caldwell, that is, rotating at sort of like that nose tackle role. So like that's really your key guys, and then Otito and some of the guys on the fringes of the depth chart as well. I think the real question about like the DT room is like how much, if Scott Matlock does make the roster, and he'll probably be in a little bit of a competition himself at the fullback with Steve O'Klotz, but how much do they want him playing DT this year, or do they want him maybe to focus on fullback? I think that's kind of like my most interesting like DT room thing to watch, like if I had to say myself. Yeah, and we are pretty deep into the episode, so if there are like repeat questions that I've already addressed, I'll kind of just quickly summarize the point as much as possible. Stephen Gillard, I'm fearful this Chargers team is actually worse than last year, mainly because they kept 67% of the interior offensive line, referring to Bozeman and Zion there, and the CB room and IDL room seem worse to me. Do you think the Chargers take a step back in year 2 under Harbaugh? I don't think they take a step back. I think they'll be about as good as they were last year, but like I said, as I said earlier in the show, I think they just play a harder schedule with more competitive teams on it, more competitive quarterbacks on paper than they did last year. And so I think when you talk about like the defense that was top 3 or top 2 last year by a lot of metrics, partially, obviously Jesse Minter is very good, but it was partially because they were playing the Jameses and the Levises of the world. If they're a top 10 defense instead of a top 2 defense, I still think that's a massive win for the team, right? Based off of the type of schedule they play this year. Offensively, if they're even close to top 10, like, and they have that kind of motion this year, that will more than make up for any potential defensive regression. So I don't see the team as worse. I think there's definitely questions about, like you said, how the interior offensive line is going to play out, how the secondary is going to play out. But I also would not discount the fact that you got Mekhi Becton in the building, of course. And, you know, in the secondary part of your question, like I mentioned earlier, I do think Derwin is such a heliocentric player, if you will, to the point where I do think he raises, kind of the rest of the secondary around him to a degree. Nuthouse at JT the Nut. How big of a deal is it that the entire staff minus one coach, referring to safeties coach Chris O'Leary, who left for Western Michigan, is coming back for the first time? Herbert has continuity. I think this is a huge advantage. I agree. Like, I think Harbaugh's talked about it ad nauseum too, like the fact that you're not having to do installs quite as much this year, and the fact that you're not starting the program from day one, even in terms of like the progress Ben Herbert has made, right? Where I remember last year they were talking about like going to Home Depot and, you know, putting things up in the gym, and even like Ben Herbert starting out at like, okay, fill out this survey form about like your height and your weight and your body mass and like all that. Like, he's had a year to work with all of these guys, not necessarily all of them. Obviously, they brought new players in via free agency in the draft, but there's a good chunk of this roster that was already like being in the program and knows the drill. So like, I think stuff like that I think is huge. And then in terms of Justin Herbert having continuity, I think the fact that he doesn't have to learn another offense this year will provide a baseline improvement for the offense, regardless of how we or you or the viewer at home, how you feel about Greg Roman. I do think that is an overlooked thing. How does Ben Herbert coordinate his strength and conditioning with players and trainers? Oh, with players, trainers. So this is a little bit the thing that's different about the NFL than like college, because like at Michigan, obviously, as he's kind of referring to in the question, like everyone is on the Ben Herbert plan, regardless of whether you sort of want to be or not, because a lot of those guys don't have their own personal trainers versus obviously NFL players do have their own personal trainers. I don't know if I'd say it's as much coordination as much as the strength and conditioning is just, hey, I guess adding on to what guys are doing with their own personal trainers, and then Herbert inputting what they should do, while they're in the facility, in the gym, and then also the goals for, hey, how they need to be dieting, how they need to be, working this muscle, working this in terms of injury recovery, right? Like that. So it is a lot less college-like, I think, in that sense, compared to, how he ran the program at Michigan. But I do think it is probably the NFL program that is closest to how one of those college teams work. And I do think all of the players have had resoundingly positive things to say about Ben Herbert, especially like, when Khalil Mack re-signed, he was like, man, I can't wait to get in the gym with Ben. I think he's received rave reviews from the players to this point. So I don't necessarily know the ins and outs and how he's running that program, but I do think clearly a lot of the players are very bought in. Bitcoin, not crypto. Do you believe Zion will play at an extremely high level and earn a contract extension? He arguably has had the best physical gifts for an offensive guard, save Quentin Nelson. I believe Zion would be an elite guard if he had better awareness. I hope he's spending more time watching film. I'm sure he is this offseason. We talked about Zion a lot already, but I'm sort of in I will believe it when I see it territory with him. I believe the skills and the tools are there on tape, but they are not used consistently enough against particularly some of the better defensive line competition leagues. So I believe he can earn that extension. He has the pathway to earn it, but I'm not there yet. Adam Weir, what do you think the ceiling is for Hampton in terms of yards and TDs? Ooh, that's a good question. I'll say the ceiling for yards is probably like 1,000. I think that's kind of a, like if Najee got hurt and he just kind of had to like carry the room for a little bit. Obviously, Najee plays 17 games, but like, I really think it depends on how both of them use their carries, like in that first 4-game stretch. Because even what they did last year, right, was like they had Gus and JK. Like people forget this a little bit, but like they both in those first 4 games got the same amount of carries, and then I think Gus went on IR for a little bit and then like came back. And then JK had clearly like distanced himself as the RB1 in the room. But like that opening game against the Raiders, I think they both had like 10 or 11 carries. And then they kind of kept that like 50-50 split between them until JK had clearly pulled away as the running back 1. And then Gus dealt with injuries and stuff. But yeah, so for Hampton, if like you're starting out in a 50-50 split, but then maybe he can pull that to like 70-30 or 60-40 at a certain point in the season, that obviously raises the ceiling relative to like competing for snaps with Najee. Harbaugh said he's used them both as starters, right? So I'd say the ceiling is like 1,000, and touchdowns are always hard to predict. I'll say like 1,008 touchdowns, and then I think on the lower end of that, just because Najee also is gonna like, Najee's gonna have his own like push little touchdowns where they get to the 1-yard line, and then there's like, all right, Najee, come in here. So he'll have his own kind of running back like vulture touchdowns there, I think, from Hampton as well. On the lower end of that, like if it is a true 50-50 split with Hampton and Harris, like really throughout the year, then I think it could be closer to like the floor being like 700 ish, 700, 800, and then like maybe like 4 or 5 touchdowns. I don't know. Again, just kind of came up with those numbers off the top of my head. Main question comes from Mintanks. Do you think the Chargers will try to unleash more of the 2020-21 Herbert? Nothing more beautiful than those Herbert deep passes. Side question, do you think we'll see the Rivers at the Hall of Fame game for Gates? I need that Rivers and Herbert interaction. It was kind of weird that last time like Rivers was at the Chargers Hall of Fame induction for Gates, that they didn't get a picture of him and Herbert together. So maybe that happens this time. I think he 100% will be there for Gates. I don't know if at the Hall of Fame game that Thursday, but I think he'll definitely be there for the Saturday induction ceremony that week. So very excited to see the content. I'm sure Rivers and LT and all those guys will be there. Do you think the Chargers will try to unleash more of the 2020-21 Herbert? I think they can. I mean, I think they showed the ability to do that at times this year. It's just like, again, if the offensive line doesn't hold up in pass protection, then like you kind of can't. Not that like the 2020 offensive line was like amazing by any means, but I think that offense was also a little bit more willing to kind of let Herbert cook a little bit in terms of, hey, like he's just kind of a rookie that's like learning to play. So you sort of have to like take the good with the bad. As far as like, statistically, right? Like, are you just going to get a bunch of touchdown and a bunch of yards from Herbert relative to like those first seasons in the league? I think that's less of a Herbert specific trend and more of a league wide trend where you just see the passing numbers down across the board for pretty much everyone over the last few years. You don't see those like Aaron Rodgers, like 40 touchdown, 4 interception seasons, or the Patrick Mahomes 50 touchdown season he had, like, what was it, 4 years ago? Something like that. When he won MVP the second time, I think. So I just think those, because of how defenses are playing now, I think those seasons are few and far between. But yeah, like I think you can reasonably see like a 4,530 touchdown season from Herbert. I don't know if that'll happen this year, but like I think that is kind of the expectation for me going forward. I don't think we're necessarily seeing like a 5,000, 40 touchdown guy, like just because that hasn't happened in the last few years outside of Herbert around the NFL, to be honest, because of some of the ways that defenses have sort of clamped down on passing offenses. So I think while we talk about Herbert and Roman and like whoever the offensive coordinator is, I think that has been the bigger reason for Herbert's stats being down than necessarily what is happening internally with the Chargers. And I think we sort of lose sight of that sometimes. Bolt fan 775, could you break down the remaining cap space and any predictions on how it could be spent? So over the cap has them at 26 million in cap space right now. So that is with most of their rookie class signed, including Hampton. Harris is the only one that has not signed to this point. Obviously, you're going to save like 5 to 10 million ish of that for in-season moves. Some of that is rollover cap as well. But to me, when I think of the signings that they could do with it, I could see Edge. Edge is not like an impossible one for me, especially like if you want Tuli to still play some special teams, if you want another rotational guy, maybe Jadeveon Clowney or like Jadeveon Clowney or like Matt Judon would be aiming a little bit too high. I think those guys can get better roles somewhere else for their own production sake, and maybe there's better fits for them elsewhere. But I would be down for either of those guys, or even like a Tyus Bowser, just someone who's like a rotational, familiar with the Ravens piece that can like come in and contribute. I don't think that's like the worst signing in the world. DT is like another one I could see, although they're kind of full on the rotation right now. And then corner is like the last one that I could realistically see where you have some guys out there like a Stephon Gilmore, or like a Jalen Mills, if you want to bring him in from the slot. So a couple interesting guys in that regard. I do think after the draft, like some of their free agent openings have kind of closed. Like, I know we and a lot of people talked about, oh my God, like are the Chargers going to reunite with Keenan? And I think that's kind of dead, to be honest. Not necessarily from like anything I've heard, but if you just look at how they've operated, It's that I don't see where the spot for him on the roster is, and I don't think they're going to pay him what he wants. And I think there's probably better roles that Keenan could get potentially elsewhere. But they drafted Keandre Lambert-Smith, and they drafted Trey Harris, and they drafted Gadsden, who is kind of more of an F tight end as well. That doesn't necessarily eat into receiving snaps, but it's just kind of like at this point, I'm not sure where the spot for Keenan is on this roster, unless like, I don't know, you seriously wanted to move on from QJ or something. But again, I have never gotten the sense that like Keenan or a wide receiver in free agency right now is on the table. I think before the draft, it was more interesting question. And then I think running back would have been interesting, but they took Omarion, and they have Rocket, and they have Fidel, and they have Najee. So like, I think the running back window is closed too. So I would say more, I lean defensive side of the ball, and then I lean towards maybe the interior offensive line, kind of like the Will Hernandez, Brandon Scherf idea that was mentioned earlier. Michael Morgan, where does our offensive line rank in the NFL? I know you amongst most hate how the offensive line was done. I don't know if I hate how the offensive line was done. I think I have questions about it, certainly. Mekhi Becton, I think, is a high enough, floor raiser to the point where you're not necessarily that concerned about like the offensive line compared to like if they just ran back Pipkins, Zion, and Bozeman from last year, for sure. But I like Slater and Alt taking a step forward. Yes, I think Slater is good. As far as like a ranking, hard to say. Hard to say really until I see them play. Like, I think the ceiling is like, could they be top 15? I think the ceiling is like 13th, and I think the floor is higher than it was last year. So I put the floor at like 18th or 19th. That's kind of what I think about them, just around the league ranking the offensive line right now. I don't hate how the offensive line was done. Like, I think I have enough questions about Zion playing center, or Zion playing left guard, or Bozeman playing center, or Bozeman playing left guard, to the point where I'm like, I can't have done that segment with Popper where we both agreed, for those who watched that bulk breakdowns that I had with him, where we all said, yeah, you need to change 2 or 3 spots right now, and then go on that interior offensive line, and then go, well, I could buy into that being top 5, top 10. Like, not really how it works. Like, was some of that maybe an overreaction to the Houston game? Yeah, at the time, I believe a little bit, but I still haven't changed my opinion on are Zion and Bozeman having breakout years this year. I don't believe that's happening. So, like, I believe certainly with the acquisition of Mekhi was good, but I do believe, yeah, they needed to do more than they ended up doing. And I think, yeah, Alt taking a step forward would be huge, and I do believe he will take a step forward. Slater, being consistently healthy for 17 games will be huge, because I think even he was going through some stuff after that Pittsburgh game a little bit, even though he played after he came back from after the Kansas City game. So, yeah, like, I think there's signs for how good this offensive line can be. I can't have said 2 months ago or 3 months ago, whenever I did that podcast with Popper, that like, I don't really believe in Zion and Bozeman going forward, push him out, and then be like, you know what? I really believe in them this year. Like, I have to trust what my eyes saw in the game, what my eyes saw on all 22. And so that's why I think the ceiling is higher. I think the floor is higher for this team than it was last year, but I still have them kind of in that quasi top 15-ish range as the ceiling. And then like, I think they would still be like the floor. The floor is an interesting conversation too, because then it's like, how much do we trust Slater's ability to stay healthy a little bit? I don't necessarily like want to dive into that conversation, but like, he has had some injury availability concerns, obviously. Alt had an injury last year, not that it was like a big one, not that his Slater's was either, but like, Slater's is more going back. I would say the floor is probably around 19th or 20th, and the ceiling, like I said, is probably like around 13-ish. Boltbro918. I really want to get hype about this year, but do you really think we can make a significant push come playoff time? Significant push come playoff time. I mean, I guess define that. Like if it requires winning a playoff game, like I think they can. Yeah. I don't see why they have a reason to not be able to do that. I think my thing, like I said earlier in the show, is I think they will be a more competitive, more playable team than they were last year, but I don't think I don't think like the playoff run of like making the Super Bowl is imminent. But do I think like if they replayed the Texans game with this roster, could they be more competitive? Yeah. And I feel that way, not just about the Texans, but the other teams in the AFC, where last year going into the playoffs, my confidence index outside of that Texans game was not particularly high. And then obviously the Texans game happened and it went lower. But I think that this team, from a playoff standpoint, is much better prepared should they make the playoffs to make an impact compared to what last year's team was going into the playoffs for sure. Who do you think RB1 is week 1? Is it different than who RB1 is week 18 from Jared Wright? Obviously referring to Najee and Hampton. Like I said, I think they're going to do kind of what they did with JK and Gus a little bit last year. Well, they'll probably be a little bit 50-50 at first, splitting the carries, and then let that develop throughout the season, depending on like, is Omarion making, the proper strides they want, which one's healthy, which ones, are there injuries in the running back room, so on and so forth. But I think it'll be like 50-50 for the first 4 to 6 weeks. And then after that, I think it'll tip like 60-40, 65-35 in favor of Omarion, if I had to guess. So I technically think Omarion will be running back 1 by week 18, but I also think Najee will obviously still have like a pretty big role in that regard. Tino from the queue. Last question. What's those underrated offseason moves by the Chargers, made by the Chargers, that you think could have a huge impact this offseason but isn't getting talked about enough? I think of something that's not being talked about enough. I would say I've talked about Aronde a lot. I don't know if a lot of people talk about him because Twitter just wants to talk about the fast receiver, so they'll talk about KLS, which I get it. I liked KLS enough. I wasn't like his biggest fan necessarily, but that will obviously, like, that downfield vertical element will be huge. But I think if the first 4 weeks, if Gadsden is ahead of where he should be in that time in terms of learning the playbook and getting involved in the offense, like, I think he could be a real X factor, and a kind of like you saw, like I said, Stone Smart down the stretch last year start to contribute in like the Chiefs game and some of those other key games he stepped up in. I think you could see that for like a Gadsden this year. But that'll do it for me. Thank you guys for watching. I rambled for way longer than I thought it would, and my internet held up, so that was great. But thank you guys for all your questions. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for genuinely still watching the show. It's not something I thought I was going to do in a week to week, kind of basis when I, started doing it separately from when I, originally left the podcast in 2023 full time to then do this once a week. It wasn't something I knew was going to continue for years and years and years. But, it makes me happy to do it and interact with you guys in the community, obviously, that we built here. And you guys obviously do a ton of stuff in terms of supporting me on Twitter, or, a lot of the other stuff that I write for Bolt Beat and the coverage of the team. And I know you guys all like that. So the fact that you guys support it means the world to me. And I will be back at some point later this offseason. Until then, Hags, as they write in the student yearbooks, have a great summer. Bolt up, and see you guys when I see you.